Okay, hello everyone. Welcome. Thank you for joining us today. Can folks hear me from my panelists, co-panelists? Good. Okay. Thank you for joining us for this exciting opportunity to learn from Professor Ronak Kapadia's book, Insurgent Aesthetics, Security and the Queer Life of the Forever War, Duke University Press, 2019. My name is Najwa Mayer, and I'll be your webinar host for the hour. I'm a Mellon Postdoctoral Fellow in Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies at Dartmouth. And just a matter of months ago, I was working on my PhD at Yale, so I'm happy to sort of return to campus in digital community for the spring 2021 Colloquium of the Council on Middle East Studies. Let me begin with some gratitude here. I want to thank the organizers of our event, the faculty and staff at CMES, including the chair, Marcia Inhorn, and acting chair, Jonathan Wurtson, Professor Zarina Graywall, postdoctoral fellows, Daniel Tavana and Vish Saktiville, the program director, Kristen Siebert, and coordinator, Marwa Kabur. Thanks also to co-sponsors, the Ethnicity, Race, and Migration Program and the Yale Center for the Study of Race, Indigeneity, and Transnational Migration. And thank you to Ronak for sharing his work with us today. And I also want to add a belated happy birthday to Ronak. So Ronak Kapadia is Associate Professor and Director of Graduate Studies in the Gender and Women's Studies Program and affiliated faculty in Art History, Global Asian Studies, and Museum and Exhibition Studies at the University of Illinois at Chicago. An interdisciplinary cultural theorist of race, security, sensation, and empire in the late 20th and early 21st century United States, Kapadia is author of Insurgent Aesthetics, which won the 2020 Surveillance Studies Network's Best Book Prize. Insurgent Aesthetics theorizes the world-making power of contemporary art responses to US militarism in the greater Middle East. Kapadia's writing appears in the Journal of Popular Music Studies, Feminist Formations, Verge, and several other journals and edited volumes. With Simone, Browne, and Katherine McKittrick, Kapadia co-edited the 2017 special issue of Surveillance and Society on Race and Surveillance. He has begun several new collaborative projects with colleagues at UIC, including a virtual seminar series on the reciprocal politics of bed space activism across contemporary social movements for disability justice, migrant justice, and abolition feminisms, funded by the Mellon Humanities Without Walls program. He's also working on a new curatorial project with the emerging veteran art movement funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities Dialogues on the Experiences of War program under the relational framework of the two forever wars in US history, the American Indian Wars and the Global War on Terror. Kapadia is also at work on a new book entitled Breathing in the Brown Queer Commons, which examines race radical queer and trans migrant futurisms and visual cultures to develop a critical theory of healing justice and pleasure across transnational sites of security, terror, and war, and in the wilds of ecological chaos and US imperial decline. On a personal note, I would only add to this impressive history of scholarship that while Ronak studies what he refers to as visionary aesthetics, he's also part of a tradition of visionary scholars in the sense that he envisions for us, his colleagues, ways to be in dialogue with and learn alongside art and artists in ways that disrupt dominant notions of the art critic or scholar analyst. And I myself often return to Ronak's work for what it ethically envisions for us as scholars of culture. I spent the better part of the last decade thinking about how contemporary global Muslim American popular cultures and arts are mired within new and historical conditions of racial and religious markets and genre histories. And what reading Ronak's work always helps me return to in the ways in which he theorizes alongside his artist colleagues is that the ethical and social imagination shaped through aesthetics also insurgently form, not despite, but in full spite of the political conditions of making art. So it is my pleasure now to pass the mic to Professor Ronak Kapadia. His talk today, drawn from Insurgent Aesthetics, is entitled Palestine's in the Sky, Insurgent Aesthetics and Queer Cosmic Utopias in the Frontiers of US Forever Wars. And while he's speaking, please just insert your questions in the Q&A box at any time, and I will moderate them after the talk. Ronak.
Greetings, everyone. Thank you, Professor Meyer, for that very warm introduction. I'm so happy and delighted to be in conversation with you, and I'm honored to be part of this CMES Colloquium series. I have to start by reiterating all of those thank yous that you just heard for everybody involved in making this virtual visit possible today at the Council, including Kristen Siebert and Maura Kabur and Jonathan Wertzen and Daniel Tavana and Vish Saktivel. And my thanks also to Zarina Graywall and friends and comrades in ERM and American Studies and WGSS and Rhythm and all the other acronyms at Yale who are joining us today in the Zoom. I see you lingering in the Zoom in the panelist list, and I'm really grateful that you're here today. I am joining you from the great indoors on the northwest side of the city of Chicago, on the ancestral lands of the Three Fires Confederacy, which includes the Ojibwe, the Odawa, and Potawatomi nations and peoples. I plan to speak for about 40 to 45 minutes, which should leave some time for our discussion. And what I want to do today is offer an exploration on the role of minoritarian expressive cultures and queer feminist aesthetics from the Middle East and its diasporas in order to adjudicate what I call the dystopian here and now. To that end, I'm going to speak in rather abstract macro terms about my book for the first 10 or 15 minutes or so, and then I'll switch registers to a close reading drawn from the book on the work of the London-based Palestinian artist Larissa Sansour. In so doing, I'm hoping that I'll illuminate the broader ways that my work tries to engage not only with race radical, queer feminist, post-colonial study and the critical life worlds it makes possible, but also how this research contributes to a range of interdisciplinary knowledge projects that centrally impacts my work, and I know the work of many of you in this Zoom as well. So my argument in a nutshell today is going to be that a turn toward what I call queer visionary aesthetics from the frontiers of US empire, including sites like occupied Palestine, can help redirect our attention to the affects, sensations, and imaginative practices of indigenous and racially or politically dispossessed peoples, practices that both underscore and move us beyond the power of imperial and settler security state control. We need these critical alternative knowledges now more than ever in the face of multiple overlapping global catastrophes. Even more so as we careen toward the one-year anniversary of our lockdowns here in North America and continue to reflect on how the past 12 months' calamities and sedimented traumas, which have barely begun to register on our collective national consciousness, let alone our individual body minds, continue unabated. In foregrounding the alternative realm of the aesthetic in my analysis of imperial horrors past and present, I'm not suggesting that we abandon our critique of the dystopian here and now, but instead prioritize creative spaces of pleasure, joy, desire, fugitivity, renewal, as well as oldies but goodies like hope, healing, and survival in calamitous times. My focus on visionary aesthetics is aimed at identifying and animating radical experiments with insurgent consciousness, with speculative, fabulist, and otherworld imaginings that defy the borders and orders of settler colonial security states. I try to engage these concepts in my recently published first book, which Najwa mentioned already, Insurgent Aesthetics. And I just realized I'm not sharing my screen yet, so let me go ahead and open up my PowerPoint and just give me a moment to gather myself here in virtual land, pull out the chat and make sure I can see everybody. Can you all see my PowerPoint okay? Najwa, give me a thumbs up. Okay. So Insurgent Aesthetics is about the interface between contemporary Arab, Muslim, and South Asian diasporic visual art and aesthetics. Let's see, can I move that forward? There we go. And US global warfare in the greater Middle East. I sought to write a book that could intervene into our dystopian here and now by spotlighting the radical experiments, sensuous knowledges, and world-making visions of contemporary minoritarian artists and cultural workers responding to the state of forever war. Turning to the more expansive world-making knowledge practices of contemporary artists, what I call insurgent aesthetics inaugurates new ways of understanding the politics of security and freedom from the perspective of those most dispossessed by US war making, as well as their diasporic kin. Armed further with a critical appreciation of the queer utopian function of art, insurgent aesthetics reveals how diasporic expressive cultures have made available new ways of knowing, sensing, and feeling that were once thought to be unintelligible or unimaginable. An analysis of insurgent aesthetics offers a politics of refreshment and an opening to think anti-racist, anti-imperialist, queer feminist politics anew. So as an interdisciplinary scholar trained in transnational American studies, I wanted to write a book about contemporary US empire in the greater Middle East that could address both the multiple scales and transformations of late modern wars, while equally imagining outside, beyond, and below its stranglehold and forms of imperial dominion, when global warfare finally misses its mark. So much of the popular and scholarly criticism on US militarism, contemporary US militarism, attunes so closely to the dominant strategies and technologies of national security that such work often has the unintended effect of making the state's frameworks and institutions seem monolithic and omniscient, even as that work seeks to critique war and empire. My book plots another more arresting approach by tracing how this global world order is in fact already fleeting, fragile, and always failing. As I described throughout, felicitous cracks have appeared in the surface of the US forever wars architecture that are being exploited by forms of fugitivity, refusal, and rebellion, and that can be gleaned further in the critical works of art under investigation in my book. So Insurgent Aesthetics theorizes the queer world-making potential of contemporary art and aesthetics in this ongoing context of US war and empire, with an explicit focus on the post-Cold War expansion of US security governance in Iraq, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Palestine. The book analyzes how global militarized security practices have affected immigrants and refugees in the United States, and how transnational visual artists in turn have exposed and contested the violence of US planetary warfare through their solo and collaborative art making. The book specifically traces how Arab, Muslim, and South Asian diasporic multimedia artists in the US and Europe have grappled in their works with the US national security state's use of gendered racial violence, included targeted killings via drones, imperial, oh, so of course I would lose my voice. It's a little dry here in Chicago, but let me sip some more water before I continue. Okay. So the US national security state's use of gendered racial violence, as I was saying, includes targeted killings via drones, imperial confinement through military detention, and overt settler colonial infrastructures via the client state of Israel and its occupation of Palestine, which is what I'm going to be speaking about mostly in the second half of my talk. So while this book focuses on the historical present, it offers a queer poetics of relationality to understand violent settler colonial histories of settlement, land theft, native genocide, African chattel slavery, and Asian exploitation as wholly vital to not only what Lisa Lowe vividly names the intimacies of four continents, but also the genealogy of the contemporary forever war. As Insurgent Aesthetics depicts, these braided histories of violence and their material afterlives are imprinted onto the DNA of the forever war and in the very practices of state violence that the artists in my book interrogate so evocatively in their creative works. The book illuminates how the forever war is not only a historical period describing a series of geopolitical and military conflicts, but also an ongoing archival project, a structure of feeling and a production of knowledge for interpreting and acting on the geopolitical alignments of the United States in the broader post-Cold War era. So the forever of forever war thus calls up a fantasy sense of temporal perpetuity in wartime's violence that likewise mimics the uninterrupted and limitless spree of US global war making across the long 20th century. And by insurgency, I'm summoning the long history of subterranean and fugitive consciousness of insurgent struggle, what Ruth Wilson Gilmore refers to as infrastructures of feeling against the forces of empire, gendered racism, and capital. This fugitive consciousness of insurgent struggle is key to making visible so as to undermine the forever war. In the process, the book makes three principal arguments that I'll outline before moving into the meat of my talk. First, by linking its investigations to a long history of US war, empire, and counterinsurgency, my book argues that new forms of remote killing, torture, confinement, surveillance, and lawfare have created a distinctive post 9/11 infrastructure of racialized state violence, both within and beyond US borders. Second, the book makes the case that contemporary art is a site of social critique that disrupts conventional myths and ideas about the US and its national security apparatus. My formal analyses of visual and performance art examine how Arab, Muslim, and South Asian diasporic multimedia artists living in the heart of empire have made palpable the unseen and forgotten dimensions of secrecy and terror that define the US security state. Third, the book argues that the forever war is an assault on the human sensorium for citizens, subjects, survivors, and refugees of US empire. Its study of contemporary art illustrates the centrality of the body and the human sensorium to both war making and to subjugated knowledge about the global war on terror. By foregrounding a queer feminist and decolonial critique of neoliberal securities and war, the book depicts what is absented and ghosted by US technologies of abstraction and state knowledge. These artists force a reckoning with the intimate, redacted, and ghostly dimensions of forever wars, what I call the sensorial life of empire. In short, Insurgent Aesthetics investigates how contemporary artists challenge violent histories of US militarism and create alternative ways of knowing, feeling, and sensing beyond permanent war. Okay, so today's talk joins this broader effort in particular by extending my analytic concern for US neoliberal and racial regimes of security to the US government's entanglement with Israeli state violence and the ongoing territorial colonization and ethnic cleansing of Palestine. I'm going to make this relational move here by attending to the critical and social potential of works by London-based Palestinian artist Larissa Sansour. Sansour's transnational multimedia art practice spans video, photography, experimental documentaries, graphic novels, and new media. I wish to think alongside two of her short science fiction films to advance the scholarly conversation on visionary aesthetics, as well as to provide an account of political imaginings of Palestine beyond the dystopian here and now, bringing together insights on the territorial, affective, and ethical dimensions of the Palestinian struggle with anti-colonial and race radical queer feminist utopian criticism. I'm going to question what outer space flight and science fiction fantasy might yield for thinking the visionary pasts, presents, and futures of Palestine anew. So here are some animating quotes that ground my discussion that we don't have time to discuss. And I'm going to throw a bunch of block text on the screen, which is the worst possible thing and the most anti-aesthetic thing one can think of for a PowerPoint. But this offers you some sense of the abstract of my talk that's going to proceed. And okay, so my analysis of Palestinian diasporic visual art and aesthetics in the context of US-Israeli security state violence and war is productively enabled by what the cultural historian Keith P. Feldman has called Palestine's breach in US knowledge production. That is the growing, if belated, constellation of intellectual and political interventions made by scholars of transnational American studies, Middle Eastern studies, Asian American studies, anthropology, queer and feminist studies, and Native American and indigenous studies, who have forged an ethical and political relationship to Palestine in their work. Collectively, these scholars have sharpened new directions in the field by situating Palestine and Palestinian solidarity at the heart of the critical American Studies project. I aim to contribute to this collective endeavor here today, and in the process to illustrate how queer, feminist, Arab, futurist, speculative imaginaries of Palestinian liberation can forward the vital form of insurgent aesthetics that I trace throughout my book. I'll add that as a non-Arab queer feminist scholar of color situated in the United States, my analysis is centrally informed by the already vibrant and heterogeneous diasporic discourse on Palestine post-return futures led by diverse groups of Palestinians themselves. To be in political solidarity with Palestine and Palestinians, I think, means using opportunities like this one to amplify Palestinian voices and a diversity of thought and practice on conversations on Palestine solidarity. Perhaps we can talk more about that in our discussion. So as part of my analysis of Palestinian visionary aesthetics in the post-Oslo period, I harnessed the critical frameworks of settler colonialism, racial capitalism, and indigenous futurisms. These three concepts are especially apt here, given the US's special relationship and shared values with the State of Israel, an alliance that took different shape after 9/11, of course, but has been expressed consistently through unprecedented and unassailable geostrategic, military, and economic support for the State of Israel for more than 6 decades. I thus join scholars seeking to capture the expanse of Israel's ongoing theft of land and resources from Palestinians, its coordinated system of apartheid, its siege on Gaza, the fences and walls it continues to build in the West Bank to annex land and restrict movement, its ongoing support of illegal settlements, and related daily atrocities in Palestine. In this context of Palestine-Israel, Zionism operates as a form of settler colonial violence, primarily through the logic of native indigenous Palestinian Arab erasure. This critical move, analyzing Zionism as a settler colonial project of racial capitalism, undermining Palestinian rights to property, inhabitants, and movement, is part of a broader reorientation of scholarship and activism away from a narrow focus on the occupied territories toward a more comprehensive focus on Israeli practices toward Palestinians inside Israel, in the occupied territories, and in the diaspora. So Israel, of course, is a leading domain for the manufacture of militarized settler security technologies, including especially its vertical and atmospheric weapons of war in the neoliberal present. This process is facilitated and financed principally by the United States through its geostrategic alliances and forever wars on security and terror in the greater Middle East. Later, I'm going to return to the abundant scholarship that details these joint strategic collaborations between military and security planners in the United States and Israel, as well as the lateral circuits of securitization and violence across incommensurable geographies that characterize the post-Cold War military consensus. However, my primary goal here today, as in my book, is to turn away from these dominant imbricated formations of state security, to focus instead on the affective structures and aesthetic forms of resistance found in Arab, Muslim, and South Asian diaspora culture, activism, and scholarship. An explicit turn toward an analysis of Larissa Sansor's Insurgent Aesthetics in the face of US-funded Israeli settler colonialism better allows us to formulate speculative alternatives to Zionist frontier relations, both in Palestine, Israel, and across the diaspora, with Palestine, now in quotes, serving as the foremost conduit and inspiration for divining those once unimaginable visionary futures. So Sansor's science fiction film trilogy provides a crucial point of departure for conjuring up seemingly impossible futures for Palestine alongside, after, and beyond the imperial violence of US and Israeli settler security states. And here I'm going to make that turn, as promised, to a close reading. So in her 2012 art, film, and digital photo series titled Nation Estate, we glean an unlikely aperture into the present-day Israeli occupation, settlements, and related miseries produced by the state of forever war. This film, is comprised of a glossy 9-minute high-definition CGI film and digital outtake photo series. Utilizing tropes of science fiction and pop culture, Sansor humorously dreams up a near-future world where the Palestinian people, left with nowhere to build but up, have constructed their own state in a single skyscraper, the Nation Estate. One colossal high-rise houses the entire Palestinian population, now finally living the high life. That's a quote. Each city has its own floor, Jerusalem on the 13th floor, Ramallah on the 14th, Sansor's native Bethlehem on the 21st, and so on. Intercity trips previously marred by checkpoints are now made simply by elevator, unquote. So as the short film opens, we see our heroine, a new arrivant to the nation state, clad in Battlestar Galactica couture, ascending this large escalator with carry-on luggage in tow. A serene voice announcer on the loudspeaker instructs new visitors, first in Arabic and then in English, to please prepare for security checkpoints. The camera then zooms into close-ups of Sansor's fingerprint and iris being scanned for biometric identification. This shot, as well as the advertisements in the elevators reminding passengers to ensure their passports are valid and up to date, provides stark reminders that prophylactic and punitive tactics of Israeli surveillance and security do not simply disappear, even in this seemingly high-tech, dystopic, decolonizing near future Palestinian society. We see shots of our pregnant female protagonist walking solemnly with purpose through the pristine, palatial, but mostly deserted lobby of the nation estate. The skyscraper itself is this monumental, if soulless, marble structure surrounded by concrete walls on the outskirts of actual Jerusalem. As the film proceeds, we hear sounds of Sansor's heavy breathing, with another extreme close-up shot depicting her blinking eye as her condensed breath fogs an invisible glass enclosure. Next, the camera pans up to a massive Palestinian flag adorning the wall. Under the sound of drum beats, we see dramatic reference to the iconic 1930s Zionist political propaganda poster, Visit Palestine, with its lush depiction of pastoral pre-war Jerusalem. Except these posters, as you see here, have been reimagined ironically instead as Visit Nation State, with images of Israel still standing apartheid wall in the distance. Finally, the short clip ends as our heroine enters a lift to make her aspirational ascent up into the nation state. So this hyper-capitalist high-rise building that Sansor imagines for us, it stands in steep contrast to the actual built environment of present-day Palestinian cities, which are generally low-rise and sprawling, even as their Arab indigenous inhabitants have become increasingly compelled to build vertically, especially in refugee camps, where horizontal expansion is undermined by the stranglehold of Israeli settlements. So here, I want to suggest that the geographical specificity that demands verticality from Palestinians under occupation also functions as a mode of material resistance in ways that point to new aesthetic strategies building on the tradition of speculative resistance on which Arab futurism as a formation might draw. The aesthetics of Sansor's luxury skyscraper likewise diverge from the high-density, low-income public housing tower blocks or council estates across Western Europe that must also serve as a significant reference for our London-based artists. These high-rise flats were created in utopian aspiration by post-war socialist-influenced governments in Europe, but now function largely as warehouses for the poor and recent immigrants and refugees. The tower block images of the council estates have reappeared in the collective Western architectural imagination after the Grenfell Tower fire in June 2017, when a 24-story block of public housing flats in northern London went up in flames, causing over 80 deaths and 70 injuries. The post-fire public outcry precipitated a formal governmental inquiry and brought renewed attention to the lack of safety precautions used by greedy residential housing developers, endemic patterns of housing segregation, and the enduring racial and economic precarities of those predominantly Arab, Muslim, and North African immigrants living in council estates in urban centers across Europe. So the accompanying outtake series of 7 photographs that I've mentioned depicts key scenes on floors of the nation estate. Each floor houses distinct Palestinians or departments, as you see here from the list, everything from Dead Sea to energy and sanitation to vertical urban planning and aid in development. While the skyscraper itself is surrounded by concrete walls, its inhabitants wouldn't be able to move effortlessly from one Palestinian city to another using elevators, and to travel in and out of the country using a high-tech subway system, a stark contrast to the manifold constraints on space and mobility that everyday Palestinians presently endure. For example, in one of the photographs, we see our heroine exploring the Jerusalem floor, cruising past a replica of the renowned Dome of the Rock Mosque as she encounters a pair of weary-eyed local residents of the nation estate. We see ads for Gaza Shore, the best sushi on the block, and other iconic squares and landmarks of lost cities have been relocated to the lobbies of each floor of the skyscraper, with residential living quarters presumably tucked away nearby. The photographs are laden with heavy Palestinian and Arab symbolism, olive trees, keffiyehs, flags, and over-the-top cliches that self-consciously depict a sterile, clinical, and cold sovereign future for Palestine. In another photograph, for instance, our lone heroine is seen nestled in her own room, performing gendered domestic chores that would seem to be crucial for future planetary survival, like watering an olive tree, that iconic natural symbol for Palestinian resistance, resilience, and connection to the land. Of course, however, in this surreal setting that foregrounds an ecological ethics as part of her queer feminist dystopian vision of Palestinian survival, the tree's roots are inexplicably growing out from her apartment floor. In another image that explores the divide between the organic and the inorganic, our protagonist is seated alone at a large rectangle dining table, contemplatively eating a salad while surrounded by dirty porcelain dishes and bowls littered in her otherwise spotless spoon. This image draws attention to an imagined endgame of settler capitalism. It further advances tropes of waste, excessive consumption, and unsustainable farming practices that disconnect the skyscraper's residents and their self-contained artificial ecosystem from the natural indigenous landscape of Palestine. An even more fantastical photograph shows Sunsor casually strolling along the beachfront of the so-called Mediterranean seafloor. A large boat is pulled up alongside the beach shore, waves crashing at her feet, with what appears to be an Israeli helicopter hovering atop the glass ceiling enclosure, surveilling the scene below. Finally, in perhaps the most haunting of all the photographs in the series, a nighttime scene depicts Sunsor peering out from her apartment's gunshot-stricken glass windows in the nation state. A reflection of the actual still gleaming city of Jerusalem just over the Israeli apartheid wall surfaces on the window while the foreground illumines the lamp of an Israeli watchtower casting a long shadow across the apartheid wall. It's as if our solitary artist protagonist is being held against her will, a reluctant witness to the vestiges of Israel's wartime violence persisting outside all around her. Above all, this final scene crafts a haunting, ambivalent future for Palestinians living the high life, including the character's unborn child. So Sansor's startling, if still glossy images in Nation Estate are meant to shock the viewer into recalling that even in this fantasy of a luxury high-rise oasis home where Palestinians finally have their own nation estate, the brutal realities of Israeli settler colonial occupation and warfare are not entirely over and gone. Instead, Sansor's speculative visual dystopia provides a mode of visionary fiction that forces her viewers to wrestle with ongoing questions about Palestinian dispossession, state recognition, and unfreedom anew. By visionary fiction here, I seek to build on and advance the conceptual work of Walida Amarisha and Adrienne Marie Browne, editors of Octavia's Brood, science fiction stories from social justice movements. These writers argue that radical science fiction is, quote, actually better termed visionary fiction because it pulls from real life experience, inequalities, and movement building to create innovative ways of understanding the world around us, paint visions of new worlds that could be, and teach us new ways of interacting with one another. Visionary fiction engages our imaginations and hearts and guides our hands as organizers, unquote. So I want to build on this framework here to capture the broader literary, visual, performance, music, and expressive cultures aligned with social justice movements that at once critique differential distributions of power, resources, and life chances in the present, while also conjuring what German Marxist philosopher Ernst Bloch once called the anticipatory illumination of art, necessary to envisage social life anew. Visionary fiction thus offers a powerful framework through which to understand the aesthetic and political projects of Palestinian diasporic artists as part of broader global freedom struggles. This prefigurative impulse behind visionary fiction and its dreams for revitalizing radical social movements and social worlds resonates deeply with the critical queer of color and queer diasporic utopian project I seek to amplify in my book, and that now guides my treatment of Sansor's visual au revoir. Indeed, a certain kernel of utopian political possibility animating queer studies has been a formative site for my critique and elaboration of visionary fiction and speculative world-making in Arab and South Asian diasporic public cultures. In the words of the late great theorist of futurity, Jose Esteban Munoz, queerness is, quote, that thing that lets us feel that this world is not enough, that indeed something is missing. We can glimpse the worlds proposed and promised by queerness in the realm of the aesthetic, unquote. So central to identifying these new futures is a focus on speculative archives, those blueprints of what Anne Speckovich calls the insurgent and experimental genres of queer cultures that attempt to make things to be created to do something. As Munoz elaborates, quote, queerness is essentially about the rejection of a here and now and an insistence on the potentiality or concrete possibility for another world, unquote. Building on concepts by Bloch, Barth, and Jameson, Munoz identified the utopian as relational to historically situated struggles, as a quotidian impulse traceable in minoritarian life. This impulse, he said, is to, quote, be glimpsed as something that is extra to the everyday transaction of heteronormative capitalism. This quotidian example of the utopian can be glimpsed in utopian bonds, affiliations, designs, and gestures that exist within the present moment, unquote. So I employ Munoz's foundational insights on the world-making and socially transformative power of queer color speculation here, not only to refine my reading of Sansor's work, but also to argue that visionary aesthetics provides a compelling perceptual regime through which to search for those elusive facts on the ground of US and Israeli securitization. My point is that concrete utopias are imminent to and emerge in relation to historical conditions of inequity that we seek to eradicate. I thus follow sociologist Avery Gordon's insight that if we define the utopia not as it's commonly defined, quote, as a homogeneous, perfect future no place, but rather as a standpoint for living in the here and now, then we might find meaningful instances of it in the history of social struggle, unquote. So I'm belaboring the connections here between queer feminist inquiry and the anti-colonial, decolonial, and race radical facets of my analysis of future imaginings of Palestine in works by Sansor, not only because queer feminist criticism best theorizes concrete forms of utopia and pleasure for differentially racialized and colonized subjects in the context of enduring settler colonial violence, but also because it is only through these interpretive frameworks, as I show, that we can draw out a more robust account of her interventions into an already vibrant array of visionary cultural works imagining the future of Palestine post-return. Sansor's visual contributions in the nation state offer this critical mode of reflection, expressing an anticipatory consciousness that is not simply an uncritical escape into the realm of fantasy, but instead a renewed point of departure for diagnosing the material circumstances, those facts on the ground of Palestine-Israel, as well as dreaming concrete utopias anew. As anthropologist Julie Petit observes about the present-day settler colonial condition in the occupied territories, quote, Palestinians often narrate their experiences of closure and related subjection as living in an open-air prison, unquote. This post-Oslo policy of closure refers to, let me take another sip. Petit has been really formative for me, and she's talking about this policy of closure which refers to Israeli restrictions on the movement of Palestinian goods, labor, and people into Jerusalem, in and between the Gaza Strip and the West Bank, and between them and Israel. For Palestinians, Petit says, closure and separation have resulted in fragmentation, economic devastation, social fracturing, and a deep sense of isolation and abandonment, unquote. So given the necropolitical impact of toxic carceral protocols of post-Oslo neoliberal governance on the lives of Palestinians, it's intriguing that Sansor appears to knowingly conjure a dystopian near-future closed-air prison skyscraper as the visionary fictive opposite of the present built environment for Palestinians living under Israeli settler colonial rule. The dream for better living that she conjures is neither an off-world escape or displaced fetish. And yet the vertical politics of enclosure and occupation are quite literally reimagined here. Sansor's visionary aesthetics allow me to highlight further the role of architecture, geography, and material infrastructures as potent sites of both violent settler colonial subjugation and anti-colonial resistance in vertical terms. To rethink the geometry of occupation and settler security state violence in this way immediately conjures the influential work of Israel architect and theorist A.L. Weissman, whose insights into the politics of verticality offer a critical language to analyze the architectural dimensions of the ongoing Israeli occupation of shrinking Palestinian lands, water, sewage, and airspace. In Weissman's estimation, the post-Oslo moment has featured new forms of bio and necropolitical governmentality in the West Bank to assemble a large three-dimensional volume layered with strategic, religious, and political strata. He describes the formation of three layers of control: the hills and valleys, groundwater and sewage, and finally airspace over the West Bank, to illustrate how the same topography is traversed in radically separate layers, a top layer allocated for Israelis and a bottom one to Palestinians. So critics of Israeli settler colonialism, it follows, must attend to both the vertical and subterranean topography as Israel maintains control of both the skies and the underworld without either appearing on political or military maps. The critical constellation of ideas, policies, projects, and regulations proposed by Israeli state technocrats, generals, archaeologists, planners, and road engineers since the occupation of the West Bank together comprises what Weisman calls the politics of verticality, a dominant epistemology for territorial enclosure and disjuncture that remains a crucial settler colonial tactic in the here and now of occupation. So the dystopian genre that Sansor advances in her work thus provides a fruitful lens to capture the affective contours of physically and socially shrinking space amidst the interminable Zionist siege on land, demography, and critical resources. Unlike Weisman's diagnosis of the dominant orders of settler security state violence in post-Oslo Palestine, Sansor is proposing a radically slantwise approach to these concerns in her art practice, a mix of critical escapology to conjure the ideas of Daphne Brooks and concrete utopian thinking a la Munoz that not only allows us to imagine otherwise, in the terms of Candace Chu, but to imagine up. Sansor's aesthetic choice of the skyscraper is particularly telling, I think, given its pivotal role in structuring social and aesthetic perceptions across the long 20th century. Whereas so much of contemporary settler colonial visualities conjure these flat images of Palestinian refugee camps and Israeli settlements dotting the hills and valleys of Palestine, this gargantuan skyscraper, that glossy emblem of modernity and progress, is a powerful instrument of perception that transformed Western modernity's modes of seeing. The first tall, fireproof metal buildings were erected in the West in the late 19th century at the apex of the imperial era, and they quickly became touted as a paramount index of the alliance of thrusting capital and adventurous technology that characterizes the driving forces of modernity. These large buildings eradicated large portions of earlier built environments and communities and often required a significant reshaping of the terrain below. This social reorganization echoes what media scholar Lisa Parks, writing on the contemporary use of drones, succinctly terms vertical mediation, the potential to materially alter or affect the phenomena of the air, spectrum, and/or ground through the vertical field. An expanse that Parks sees as extending from the Earth's surface, including the geological layers below and built environments above, through the domains of the spectrum and the air to the outer limits of orbit. Skyscrapers also vertically mediate airspace, built environment, ground, historical memories, and ways of being buried beneath and around them. The skyscraper thus up gives us this another perceptual regime through which to reimagine the politics of verticality and vertical mediation, even as we hold on to the vulnerability and fragility of vertical living that she depicts. It also offers a tongue-in-cheek response, of course, to the gulfy obsession with erecting skyscrapers to conjure a sense of national greatness in tall buildings that now dot the skyline of the Arab states of the Persian Gulf. In short, Sansor's nation estate reads architecture and technology as viable but vexed tools for decolonization and the fraught project of sovereignty for the dispossessed. Nation estate draws on an earlier work by the artist titled A Space Exodus, which is the second and final piece I'll discuss closely today. And I just want to check in. Are you still with me? Najwa is giving me a thumbs up. When you're in Zoom land and you're disconnected from reality, it's hard to know if anybody's still in the Zoom, but I trust that you're with me. Okay, so this last piece that I want to talk about. Here, Sansor adapts Stanley Kubrick's 1968 science fiction film, A Space Odyssey, but for the Palestinian-Israeli context. The music scores of the original film are reimagined with the cadences and chords of Arab music and surreal visions that posit Sansor herself as the first Palestinian into space. Parodying Neil Armstrong's iconic moon landing, Sansor plants the Palestinian flag, her buoyant dance stretching across the lunar surface. That's one small step for a Palestinian, she says, one giant leap for mankind. Her invocation of Exodus here in the title echoes both the expulsion of 700,000 Palestinians from their land in 1948, as well as the Israeli perspective of history and the creation of their own mythology that influenced Western understandings, tragically, of the Palestinian reality. and the biblical Exodus, of course, and the use of that by the state of Israel to reiterate mythologies such as a land with no people for a people without a land. We witness here an outer planetary, if solitary, land grab that reimagines one of America's finest moments, the moon landing, as a Palestinian triumph. In the final scene of A Space Exodus, oh, here's the installation with all the little guys, the little Palestinauts that were part of the installation when the show is usually exhibited. And in this final scene of A Space Exodus, the censor, the astronaut, a la Sandra Bullock in Gravity, peers off at Earth, glistening, perhaps smoldering with its apocalyptic wars in the distance. A Space Exodus likewise echoes the roots of astrofuturism in the United States. This concept refers to the aesthetic, scientific, and political movement that developed amid mid-century Cold War commitments to the space race, when outer space represented, on the one hand, speculation about colonial explorations and the presumed imperial ends of US technological and political power, and on the other, liberal and utopian ideals for solutions to the conflicts and perils of modern American life. In DeWitt Kilgore's estimation, astrofuturists sought the amelioration of racial difference and social antagonisms through the conquest of space. The narratives of planetary exile that Kilgore reads have been critical to Black freedom movements in the forms of Afrofuturism and Afro-surrealism. These stories feature African Americans and their diasporic counterparts cast out into outer space in the search for another planet on which to produce a culture free of the racism, genocidal mania, and hierarchical economic systems advanced by Eurocentrism and Western imperialism. And yet, as Ramzi Fawaz writes in his treatment of the racial and colonial context of Afrofuturist cinema, quote, narratives of planetary exile often results in an investigation of the very world or worlds that one intends to escape, sometimes even more so than the supposedly utopian place of exile itself. Sansor's A Space Exodus not only conjures the echoes of Afro and Astro-futurist political and aesthetic traditions, but also makes available a critique of the present-day securitization of aerospace. The piece calls attention to the contemporary logics of war on terror, in which aerospace represents the so-called final frontier for both US and Israeli global counterinsurgency operations and their quest for full-spectrum dominance. The historian Alfred McCoy has noted, for instance, how the Obama administration presided over a technological revolution in defense planning, moving the nation far beyond bayonets and battleships to cyber warfare and the full-scale weaponization of space. McCoy warns us that the occupations of Iraq and Afghanistan in the early 21st century have served as the catalyst for a new information regime, fusing aerospace, cyberspace, biometrics, and robotics into an apparatus of potentially unprecedented power. US security experts hope the integration of aerospace weaponry will evolve into a robotic command structure that would be capable of coordinating operations across all combat domains: space, cyberspace, sky, sea, and land. So the advancement of military technologies and the constitutive illusion of technomastery, ostensibly central to the future of US's global dominion, begs the ultimate question. What do US global counterinsurgency operations in outer space have to do with Palestine and Israel and the global security state apparatuses that structure the ongoing colonial present? Well, when analyzing the outer planetary ambition of US forever wars, it's crucial to underline the transnational connections between the United States and Israel as joint settler colonial security states, whose sovereign claims to territorial jurisdiction have drawn on shared covenantal narratives that underwrite the permanent dispossession of native peoples. These insights call attention to the strategic collaborations between military and defense planners in the United States and Israel, and trace what Laleh Khalili calls the horizontal circuits of securitization that broadly characterize the post-Cold War era. Beginning in the late 1980s under the drug wars and then later after 9/11, there was this massive restructuring of domestic and foreign police forces under the rubric of Homeland Security, of course, which paved the way for a transnational network of policing and military strategies across uneven occupied areas, including urban Black communities in the United States and occupied Palestine. If, as many scholars have recently argued, Palestine is the so-called archetypal laboratory for the development and articulation of new technologies of security and late modern war making, then perhaps outer space can serve as the template and testing ground not only for US and Israeli global counterinsurgencies, but also for utopian imaginings beyond the here and now of settler security violence. My point is that these experts are not the only ones who share information. Instead, we benefit from turning to the transnational and diasporic networks of knowledge and affiliation produced by radical diasporic culture producers, Afrofuturists and Arab futurists alike, precisely for the alternative logics of security and freedom that they manifest in their works. So in that spirit, and by way of conclusion, I want to revisit this final scene and premise of Sansor's lunar setting in a space exodus. Okay, so what is particularly queerly beautiful about Sansor's futurist vision of Palestine is that it neither elides the realities of Israeli occupation nor capitulates to a sense of its inevitability. The political messiness and contaminated status of the artist's visionary aesthetics aligns neatly with the strand of decolonial queer studies I've invoked in this talk. After triumphantly planting the Palestinian flag, Larissa the astronaut appears to lose connection with Jerusalem, the homeland. She calls out, quote, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, like Houston, Houston, but there is only radio silence from the other side. Some critics have read this final scene as an allegory of the Palestinian people's tragic nightmare, a depressive sign of the hollowness of their deterritorialization and the loss of their continuous temporality. In her review of the piece, Palestinian-American critic Helga Tawil-Sori laments, quote, even if we follow our dreams to the edge of the universe, even if we plant our flag on new territory, we will still feel defeated, we will still be lost if there is no communication, no response, no connection to Jerusalem, unquote. I want to suggest another queer reading of what happens when we follow Sansor's move through the Earth's upper atmosphere to outer space and linger otherwise in the lunar zone. What might it mean to be lost in space, untethered, exiled, cast out beyond the horizon, unbounded, far from home? If this represents the unshakable dystopian here and now of the Palestinian diasporic people under constraints of Zionist framings, how might we imagine a then and there of Arab futurist and queer cosmic utopian possibility in the terms of the late great Jose Munoz? Munoz's prophetic contributions to queer utopian hermeneutics animate or haunt my interest in Sansor's dystopic fantasy vision of a Palestinian future, as well as the intimacies of racialized and indigenous bodies and their inhabitations writ large. In an early essay on gesture, ephemera, and queer feeling, Munoz reminds us that, quote, the dispossessed are appropriately adept at critiquing possession as a logic. He goes on, we can understand queerness itself as being filled with the intention to be lost. Queerness is illegible and therefore lost in relation to the straight line's mapping of space. Queerness is lost in space, or lost in relation to the space of heteronormativity, unquote. Perhaps we can identify here not only a repudiation of heteronormativity, but as I've suggested today, the normative violence of settler colonial security states too. In this final scene of a space exodus, the antagonisms on Earth have led to a sense of permanent exile, a forever quest to search for new homes. Sansor leaves us with this structure of feeling that is not only about statelessness, but weightlessness too. To be without gravity, untethered by the weight of the body and its inscriptions, is a queer feminist decolonial sensation. I dwell on world-making insurgent aesthetics to theorize forms of critical self-enactment and to advance new approaches on queer feminist decolonial flight, on escape, on being illegible, about being missing in action, perhaps even unreadable even by the superpanoptic gaze of US, Israeli surveillance and security states as they try to reach all the way up to the heavens. In closing, I've established a critical intimacy with the sensuous projects of Larissa Sansor to ask after other worlds and to launch an inquiry into how other worlds matter for being in this world. If cosmic queerness is to be lost, then perhaps we don't want to be found, at least not on the security planner's map of settler colonial violence. Being lost, untethered, cast out into outer space gives us new ways of imagining the politics of verticality and atmospheric wars, as well as a generative decolonial queer praxis of sensing and feeling vulnerable in relation to others in the world. Searching for Palestines in the sky, where Zionist strangleholds on the present are no more, enacts what Munoz calls a form of politicized cruising, identifying and animating affective and cognitive maps of the world that a critically queer utopianism can create, maps that do include utopia. By enfolding and unfolding Sansor's speculative diasporic visualities, I have sought to infuse into accounts of Palestine's dystopic here and now a renewed and newly animated sense of the social that can be glimpsed and felt in Arab futurist diasporic culture productions. My contrapuntal queer feminist reading of these deterritorialized fantasies offers a form of insurgent aesthetics that critiques Israeli security state violence while simultaneously centering diverse modes of Palestinian insurgency. An analysis of Larissa Sansor's visionary aesthetics thus allows us to move beyond the perverse calculus of settler colonial violence to propose urgently needed alternatives to US and Israeli forever wars, while also asking after Palestine's queer life worlds, past, present, future, and in the sky. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ronak, for that illuminating and moving talk. We're going to go a little bit over the hour so that we can get some Q&A in. And I'd love the audience, let me see. Please go ahead and add any questions you have to the Q&A dialogue box. I know that Ronak is eager to connect with folks despite this kind of cold webinar format. I'll begin though with the first question. This is kind of a multi-part question, so please take whatever draws you. Your book is about scales in many ways, as you just demonstrated. And I want to ask you about diaspora as a category that is scalar, that is relational, but is also particularly situated perspective, a particular perspective for each artist in your book. So how is diaspora a kind of locus for insurgent aesthetics? How does a diasporic insurgent aesthetic transform our idea of the region of the greater Middle East, or perhaps invoke another kind of region altogether, sort of calling on Gayatri Gopinath here? And what, if anything, falls away if diaspora foregrounds our vision of insurgent aesthetics?
That's a great question, Najwa. First, you already mentioned Gayatri Gopinath's Unruly Visions and her work in queer diasporic critique, which of course is very formative to me, and that whole generation of queer diasporic and queer color critique, which provided the space, the kind of conceptual ground clearing for thinking about subjectless critique and queer studies, is what enabled this kind of project in the first place, to use the language of queerness to talk about race and empire and the kind of violence, of ongoing violence of US state violence and warfare. So diaspora, partly what I'm getting at here is I wanted to focus on folks who are in the belly of the beast of empire, people in the US and Europe whose part of their insurgency is their estrangement from their homelands. It is the kind of entangled relation that they have to homelands. And part of what queer diaspora studies offers us is a sense of the messy entanglement, the kind of critique of purity politics, right? And so I think part of what I like about foregrounding diaspora is that it attends to the messy, contaminated entanglements that produce new kinds of conceptual mappings, new arrangements. That's partly what that South-South exchange is about in queer diaspora studies. And I think in some sense, if we focus only on like the relationship between the US and Israeli security states, which I do attend to considerably in this talk, we lose all of the kinds of transnational networks of affiliation and knowledge that are produced sensuously across different spaces. And diaspora is the glue. It's the glue that coheres these social relations across people who don't necessarily have a lot in common. And I think that's also speaks to the kind of framing in the book of Arab, Muslim, and South Asian, as I talk about it as a kind of queer poetics of relationality. That's a non-blood-based form of identitarianism. It's not really, that concept of Arab, Muslim, South Asian, of which there are many of those kinds of concepts, Swana, et cetera, that came out of the early 2000s period. These were all strategies of coalition that people were trying to enable in the diaspora to think about the complexities of racialization in various colonial histories. And while Arab, Muslim, South Asian doesn't mean the same thing in 2021 as it did in 2002 or 2003, I hold on to the kind of evanescent dimension of that, because I think there's something really compelling about putting seemingly dissimilar histories, communities, geographies in synergetic relation. And so in that sense, you can see that I'm deeply informed by post-colonial feminism and all that it's offered us. So that's why I'm holding on to diaspora. That's the part I'll say for now. There's more, but I'm conscious. I'm not seeing questions. Are you seeing questions on your end?
I have a question. Yeah, thank you. I mean, you said so much there that's really interesting, because I'm interested also in how that kind of tripartite that you're thinking about, how it falls away in the current moment. But I want to make sure to get audience in here. And we have a question here from, I believe it's Aaron Keeble. What a fantastic talk and book. Thank you. Could you say more about the skyscraper in nation estates? I understand the critical gestures you have identified in Sun Tzu's work here, the comments on what skyscrapers represent and evoke, but I wonder if this verticality or building up also references the ever shrinking boundaries of Palestinian space. I'd also love to hear more about the connection to contemporary social housing in the West, Grenfell, et cetera. I'm sure you covered all of this, but so much of it is interesting content to digest, which we agree.
Yeah, thank you, Aaron, for that question. So what to say here? There's a lot of ways to come into this. The first is to note that part of what I'm doing in this talk and in the book is paying attention to the artist circuit. So the artist becomes interested in questions of architecture, for example. And so that opens up the space for me to think about, oh, what are the material infrastructures that allow Israeli settler colonial violence to continue and perpetuate seemingly indefinitely in this moment, right? And so then paying attention to the politics of verticality and all that discussion about A.L. Weissman and Israeli architects and other critics of Israeli settler colonialism who are paying attention to the vertical dimensions of human world making. So paying attention to subterranean space, the built environment, and then this question of spectrum, air, and orbit out, right? That's the, as Naja was saying, the attention to the multiple scales of US empire. At the same time, I'm interested in the multiple scales of diasporic insurgent forms of speculation. So this is what's interesting about concepts like utopia or the kind of speculative more generally, is there's always this dialectical thing happening, right? Speculation is the domain of empire and capital, and it's also the domain for these kinds of insurgent and resistance forms at the same time. And so I think paying attention to that and always being really mindful that the art that I'm looking at is always also a critic and theorist of the security state and its apparatus. That's precisely the kind of cohort of artists that I'm looking at. There are a very select sliver of contemporary artists who are also attending to these dominant forms, but not staying there, right? Because as I said at the beginning of the talk, part of my goal is to move away from the kind of diagnoses of the dominant, of which we have endless number, right? And to actually spend some time with the alternative. But that alternative is not somehow untethered from the dominant. This is where the dialectical thing becomes important, right? So the alternative is very much a materialist critique of the here and now, even as it projects towards the future. So I think you're right that the question, and now the question has moved on, but the question of architecture and the shrinking space and of the skyscraper, I think Sun Tzu means that both ways. The limitlessness of the thrusting capital of the skyscraper in the sky, but also a recognition of the shrinking boundaries of Palestinian space in the here and now. And it's supposed to conjure that twin sense of both expansiveness and shrinkingness. Naja, does that make sense to you? You're reading the next question.
It does. And the next question actually ties in. So about sort of scale and speculative traditions. Thanks. This is from Natalia. Thanks for this illuminating talk. I really enjoyed it. Sun Tzu's use of the skyscraper and verticality as a mode of re-envisioning settler colonialism put me in mind of Colson Whitehead's speculative fiction, The Intuitionist, of course, because of its thinking about verticality, but even more the Underground Railroad for the way that it reorganizes a sequence of time, phases of US racism as spatial dispersion. I'm wondering if you could expand further on the convertibility between horizontal, I can't even.
I'm with you.
The horizontal and the vertical
in
visionary fictions.
Yeah, lots of terms. But what I really take away, and thank you, Natalia, for this question, is so this speaks back to the original question you asked, Naja, about diasporas. Because I'm an American Studies scholar, and I'm situated in the United States, and I'm reading Afrofuturism and indigenous futurisms, Native North American futurisms. And I'm trying to think about Sun Tzu's projects in relationship to Afrofuturism and indigenous futurisms. new things kind of open up. And one example of that, of course, is the kind of conviviality between the work of Whitehead, especially in the Underground Railroad, and these kinds of Afrofuturist visions of the afterlives of slavery with the work that Sansur is doing. Now that's complicated, right? And for lots of reasons. And in the book I talk, I have 101 pages of footnotes where I go into discussions about the complexities of putting into conversation contrapuntally Native North American Indigenous studies and Black studies, and reading those frameworks through a pan-Arab futurism or Palestinian futurism. And so, your question is spot on, because it speaks to the kind of diasporic gaze, which is to say, how do we think about the traffic between these seemingly dissimilar knowledge projects, which I think speaks to Zarina's question. The next question is Zarina's asking about, or do you want to read it off, Madral, if we want to keep the oh, you're muted.
I can. So from Zarina, one of the wonderful things about your talk and your book is the wide range of fields and theorists you are in conversation with. I imagine many of your readers are not always reading as widely as you are, Ronak. I wonder if you can tell us if there has been a persistent misreading of this work, given how nuanced your argumentation is.
Okay, so this is a good question and segue to the last point, because somebody who's a critical ethnic studies scholar reading in Black studies and Native studies, and of course is situated more legibly within Asian American studies, even though this project is transnational and is about US world making and US violence in the greater Middle East region. So that's a lot of different ways in which the work becomes illegible or legible, and that our job as interdisciplinary folks is to read promiscuously across all of those artificial boundaries of knowledge formation, right? And try to pull all those kinds of critical knowledge projects into conversation. And that work is exhausting, and it's never finished. And it's also very exciting. It's the kind of work that most speaks to me and compels me, is that kind of comparative and relational thinking. I reference Lisa Lowe's Intimacy of Four Continents, which is of course so formative to so many of us, but it's like a paradigm shifting in the sense of how we think about the kind of work that we're doing. So what I've come across now, the book has been out for a year plus, is that it gets read very differently in Middle Eastern studies spaces versus critical ethnic studies spaces versus queer study spaces. And that's not surprising, I suppose, because people have different investments in those fields and they're different proper objects and different formations. But I am noticing that because the work is synthetic and it's drawing together all of these formations, that sometimes it's hard to pin down in ways that I'm sure, Zarina, you experience in your own projects and your own research, which have also been very formative to me. And I wish we had more of a Zoom interface where I could now call on you and ask you to sort of weigh in here and talk to me a little bit about the complex, how do I put this? The consequences of the transnational American studies moment of a decade ago, the consequences of the queer of color critique moment from a decade or 15 years ago, and for my generation of scholars, and Najwa, you included, right, who are doing this work situated in American studies, but connected to all of these other formations, reading wildly and porously across all these spaces, how to make our work legible to all those spaces simultaneously. I don't know how to do that. And I'm not sure that that's necessarily a necessary goal. One thing I have noticed is that artists and curators, contemporary artists and curators, not only folks from South Asian Middle Eastern diasporas, but across minoritarian aesthetics writ large, have been very compelled by the objects of study and the kind of theoretical enterprise of the project, because it's foregrounding the centrality of the knowledge work that artists do. That it's not simply a kind of representational practice, but it is itself an alternative epistemological formation that is produced through creativity, through expressive culture. So I'm compelled by the kinds of conversations I've been having with artists, with curators, with other interdisciplinary cultural workers who also ride that line of lingering in the lunar zone, but also read promiscuously as well. So that's what I would say to Zarina.
Thank you. If there are more questions, please keep them coming. I guess I have a related question about this idea of legibility and also some of the sort of the kind of paradoxes in terms of like insurgent aesthetics and how and where these artists are particularly situated. So I have a research interest in artist networks in relation to global art markets. And I know this isn't at the center of your project, but it certainly intersects with how you're thinking about you put it as the social potential of aesthetics. You describe how in researching sort of elite diasporic artists, one paradox is how they're positioned in privileged transnational careers and largely in global imperial cities. Of course, I'm sure each of them like circumnavigates political and economic borders as well as their home countries differently. But for example, an artist like Mariam Ghani, who you analyze in this book and whose work as an Afghani refugee myself, I appreciate, but she's also the daughter of the current president of Afghanistan, and they have co-produced projects together, which is a point that sometimes falls away, but also directly impacts how she's been circulated in global, and particularly how she's legible in American art markets differently than some of the other artists in this book. And I might add also that it situates her differently in relation to state archives, especially in an artwork like Trespassers that you discuss in your book about Afghani American translators in the US military. So my question that is maybe peripheral to the narrative of the book, but maybe is highlighted in how you research the book is how are you thinking about these artists in or as networks and in relationship to art markets?
It's a huge question, and it was the sort of side book I wanted to write all along about this, as of course, you know, when you're researching your first book, it's over a period almost of a decade, and these folks were in a different, they were circulating differently a decade ago than they are now, which is also important to know. But you're right to note, as I do in the book, that Ghani is the daughter of Ashraf Ghani, and you know, what does that mean, and how do I think about that in relationship to the language of insurgency that I'm also marshaling throughout the project? So it's a well-pointed and astute critique, I think, of this collection of artists. But it also said, you know, what I want to say is, frankly, contemporary art writ large, especially contemporary art based in the US and Europe, is a product of US empire. It is, you know, these global art markets in, you know, the Laura Shabibi gallery in Dubai. I mean, these, you know, in the UAE, like these, all of the proliferation of global biennials, all of this is a product of US empire and its satellite coordinates. And that's another book to write. And I think, and I'm excited that folks are starting to think about that, about what this proliferation of global art markets has meant, both for the legibility of Arab, Muslim, South Asian, Middle Eastern, Afghan, Iranian artists in the contemporary period, who continue to be illegible on, for example, syllabi in art history in the United States and visual culture classes, right? They're pitched, if they are there at all, they're only as like the War on Terror week, for example. But then it's an extraordinarily elite circuit at the same time, and how to think about that in relationship to the kinds of very critical knowledge projects that are coming out of their work that is very much enmeshed, embedded in the workings of US empire. So that is something that I've left certainly unfinished and that I'm continuing to think about. And I want to talk to you more about, and maybe we can find a way to collaborate and talk about that in the future, because I think it is a really salient point to note that you know, contemporary art in this moment is running on this extraordinarily elite transit and circuit, and it's often not at all in conversation with the kind of contemporary popular culture that is emanating simultaneously. And so there's that dissonance too that I would like to explore. That certainly wasn't the subject of Insurgent Aesthetics, but I think for future projects is something I'm curious about.
Mm-hmm. But there were certainly elements there. I have another question here from Camila. Thank you for such an insightful and inspiring conversation. Related to that last question and on the topic of legibility in diaspora, I'm curious to hear about how, as people who sit at the privileged intersection of academia and organizing, we might engage the power of insurgent aesthetics and thinking of specific art forms like censors in the work of building power among poor and working class migrant communities in US cities. Can't wait to read your book.
Oh goodness, thank you, Camila. Well, this is actually the subject more precisely, more narrowly, of my new project, Breathing on the Browne Queer Commons, which is about queer queer and trans migrant visual cultures and the kind of the mixing of high and low in ways that, the question just disappeared. So now it's just disappeared out of my brain.
Sorry, go to the answered. I'm sorry.
Okay.
If you click
Okay.
answered, it's there.
Okay, we're getting the visual. Yeah, so I mean, this is a really salient question. So this work, it sits at the intersection of contemporary art and academia and activism. How does it make space for the organizing? First of all, it's inspired by decades of multi-issue, multi-ethnic coalitions and organizing of immigrant justice activists and abolitionists and anti-war activists and anti-imperialist work. That's the sort of surrounds of a project like this. It's also important to dissemble or dissolve the seemingly artificial boundaries between art activism and academia, and to remind us that these cultural workers are often occupying multiple spaces simultaneously. And in fact, in the book, especially in chapter 3, I talk at length about collaborative and collective art practices. And many of those folks are lawyers or organizers or filmmakers whose solo work I don't look at, but then I look at the kind of collaborative collective work they've been doing over 2 decades. And it's important to note that the strand of interdisciplinary cultural work that I'm attending to means that there's a lot of possibility for overlap between art activism and academia. It's also a recognition that artists, academics, those of us situated in university spaces need to be paying attention to the kind of organizing and activism that's happening in our cities, in our spaces. And one of the things that is not fully manifesting through this book is that I revised this project. It was researched during the Bush II era, written during the Obama years, finished during the Trump years, but it was revised while I was living in Chicago, surrounded by the incredible abolitionist feminist organizing that's happening in my city. And that has changed the kind of tenor and the logics of my projects. And it speaks more to the second book, which is about the kind of domestic dimensions of homeland security and questions of migrant justice and abolition. So I'm changing over time too. And I think that's important for us to remember that as academics, we write this thing, it's a flashpoint of our thinking in a particular moment. And then if we're open-hearted and supple to what's happening, we're also evolving over time. And I think that's how I would respond to that question. Thank you, Camilla.
Thank you. So I don't see any more questions, and we are well over our slotted time because of this wonderful discussion, which I certainly learned a lot from, and I sort of like that we're ending on this point of collaboration and humility in academic work. Do you have anything you want to conclude with,
I just
Ronak?
want to note that I just want to say hi to all the folks who are still hanging on in the panel, including several of my graduate students who I see from Chicago. That's always lovely. Thank you for being here. And thank you, Najwa. I look forward to future opportunities for us to be in dialogue and to hear the kinds of work that you're engaged in. And I think what's exciting is that 5 years ago or so, 10 years ago, there weren't a lot of people doing art, visual culture, art history in our sort of sect sliver of the world that I'm surrounded by. And since the book has come out, I'm meeting lots of people who are doing this kind of work. And I'm also reading a lot of unpublished manuscripts of folks who are coming up who are doing similar kinds of projects. And it makes me feel excited that we've developed a little bit of a sliver of the universe of the intellectual and political projects that we're all engaged in overlapping. So thank you for your time.
Same, Ronak, thank you. Thank you for your generosity. You're also sort of forging the path for many of us that are just, a little ways behind. So thank you so much. And I do want to make a note here that in the chat, Daniel has referenced the next event in the CMES Colloquium, which will be held on March 11th at 12 p.m. Saudi, Arizona, the past and present of arid empire and desert connections, and you can RSVP there. So thank you all once again for joining us for this talk, and thank you so much, Ronak Kapadia, for sharing this beautiful work with the world, and we look forward to the next one.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good day.
Thanks, Ronak.